RAF Chinook helicopter with 29 people on board has crashed in the west of Scotland. It hit a hill in thick fog. An eyewitness reported hearing...
The Army had lost 9 senior officers, 10 RUC, all of them special branch, 5 MI5, 1 civil servant, all gone.
No one can pretend that this is not a catastrophic loss.
25 people who'd given their lives to understanding the complexities of intelligence in this part of the world.
And then you had the 4-person crew.
John Tam and Rico, they are Special Forces pilots. You had 2 experienced loadmasters, all 4 of them. These were the best the RAF had.
For me, from the start, the whole thing just smelt bad.
I met Air Vice Marshal Day, and I said, I just can't understand what happened. And his comment to me was, you have to understand people make mistakes. And I was going, what does it mean? Had they decided that early on?
I am Squadron Leader Robert Burke, RAF retired. I retired 23 years ago. My father was a squadron leader killed in France in 1940, trying to stop the German army advancing. They were without fighter cover. He was killed before I was 1, and from the age of 3, I didn't want to do anything except become an RAF pilot. I joined at 18, in fact, and I was invalided out after about a year because of boxing injuries. And I got back in, partially due to the efforts of Douglas Bader, among others, who I knew quite well. Flew Provost and Vampires, old Vampires were still flying, and I flew Vulcans for quite a long time. And I said I've always wanted to fly helicopters because they're extremely interesting. So I went through a helicopter course, and then because I happened to speak Malay, purely by chance, off I went to Brunei for nearly 4 years and helped start the Sultan's Air Force, and I was the old Sultan of Brunei's personal pilot, the current Sultan's father's personal pilot. So afterwards, I was posted to a Puma squadron back onto Wessex. I was flying Chinooks, which meant that I spent quite a lot of time in Northern Ireland. I really enjoyed it, and I did the first night goggle operational flying in the Air Force there, which shifted the balance of power in South Hamar for a bit, because we flew without lights, and it caught the provisionals down in Crossmaglen and Forkhill rather by surprise, because you can't tell where a helicopter is at night. In 1994, I was the unit test pilot or station test pilot at Odium. My main job was flying aircraft after rebuilds, or when something was wrong with them which couldn't be analysed in the air by other pilots or on the ground. And we were doing the road testing for the Mark II Chinook. I had real concerns that the Mark II Chinook was not fully developed for service. I had fought against going to Northern Ireland, and so did the Chinook flight over there, John Tapper. He asked for a Mark I to be kept over there because of his worries about the Mark II, and particularly about this specific aircraft.
Down below, devastation, the charred landscape, and wreckage of the Chinook helicopter.
A Hercules transport plane brought air accident investigation teams to the tiny RAF base at Machrihanish, 15 miles north of the crash site. They've now begun picking through the wreckage to try to establish what went wrong.
I was with the Air Accidents Investigation Branch as a Senior Inspector of Air Accidents Engineering. The initial thing was to cordon off the area where the aircraft had first hit, where there was likely to be some relevant evidence. There were pieces of rubber bladder tank, fuel tank, embedded in the rocks. You could smell kerosene very strongly. What was the spread? 200 metres across the hill, I think. So just from that, and the degree of breakup of the wreckage, you could say, well, it wasn't a slow accident. It was pretty fast for a helicopter.
When Ian died, we wanted to see the site. Couldn't go immediately, which is, of course, what I wanted to do. You need to be, you need to see, you need to understand. Your brain sorts it out for you. We'll just get through this.
It's an awful realization that just grows in you over time. You know, you hear the words, but you don't understand what they mean, really. My father died, and it's so shocking and so unexpected, you know, so sad.
My father, being a pilot, started preparing us. He said, lots of things can cause an accident. And at the end of the day, pilot error is one of those things. And we have to be prepared. That might be the official verdict. So it's a case of getting yourself, in some way, psychologically prepared that we may not like what we hear.
It was agreed that the wreckage would be removed, then taking it off to Farnborough to lay the wreckage out on the floor. The investigation was very short of evidence as to what might have happened because there were no eyewitnesses, no flight data recorder information, and no cockpit voice recorder. So there's a structural layout, and from various clues you piece them together as far as you can. And yeah, that told us, well, she came in upright where the aircraft had hit the rear underside on a rocky outcrop before it then went airborne and sustained further damage from rotor blade strikes on the cabin before then suffering a major impact. As regards the likely cause of the crash, you can only follow the evidence. You can come up with a number of possibilities. You can argue about plausibility of each of those. And that's what I told them. And what the RAF chain of command made up of it was up to them, really.
Virtually a year after the crash, we were invited to RAF Odeon. My father, my sister and myself were given the press release that was going to be released later that day. We were given the summary report from the RAF Board of Inquiry, and the press release was very clear. The crash was caused by the gross negligence of both pilots, which obviously was a very severe accusation. And even though we were prepared for the fact it might be pilot error, we weren't prepared for that level of accusation.
The Ministry of Defence said in the headline that ultimately the two pilots were to blame. And they weren't just to blame and it was an aircraft accident. They were guilty of negligence to a gross degree. These two pilots essentially were cowboys, and they flew the thing with gross negligence into the ground.
Today's report finds that pilots wrongly continued to fly towards high ground on the Mull of Kintyre in unsuitable weather conditions, that they failed to operate the aircraft safely, and that both pilots had been negligent.
Not beyond reasonable doubt, but beyond any doubt whatsoever. It's a much higher bar than in a court. This was extraordinary.
I was the first one to get that finding, and I broke that story in the June of '95 at the Belfast Telegraph.
And then I got a phone call from the veteran journalist David McKittrick, who said to me,
"You're missing the story."
We then read the summary report, RAF Board of Inquiry report, and went through each page, and page after page, there was no evidence to support the accusation. The report clearly stated in individual paragraphs for each pilot that neither could be guilty of human failings.
The conclusions of the RAF's investigation said it would be inappropriate to conclude negligence on behalf of either one.
So how could that state that, yet the official verdict be gross negligence? It came to light that within their system, senior reviewing officers are allowed to overrule things, and so the official verdict was actually the opinion of two senior officers. It was nothing to do with the actual Board of Inquiry.
Air Vice Marshals Ratton and Day
concluded on their own, without evidence, that in their opinion, the pilots were guilty to a gross degree. And that was the public statement that was given.
An official report has concluded that pilot error was to blame for the Chinook helicopter crash in Scotland a year ago, in which 29 people died.
So when that happened, I realized that I'd been taken for a fool. And I wasn't prepared to let the story end with that.
At the end of it, my father looked up to the officer who was looking after us and he said, "Where's the evidence?" "There is no evidence." And the officer was just speechless. He didn't know what to say. My father told him, "You go back to your superiors and you tell them this means war. We are not going to let this rest until we have some answers."
I did not understand how that conclusion could have been reached, really. I mean, it was a very simple case of not appreciating that absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. Nothing was found wrong, therefore there was nothing wrong. Therefore, it can only have been pilots misbehaving. And that is not a sequence that I would subscribe to.
My mind immediately set off alarm bells. I mean, this was Marchioness, this was Flixborough, this was Bloody Sunday, this was Hillsborough. Same old thing all over again. The closing of the ranks. Let's immediately protect reputational damage as we see it. And for God's sake, blame two people who can't fight back because they're dead. And that stank.
Although pilot error and not technical failure was to blame, at a press conference today in Belfast, the families of those who died said they didn't bear any bitterness against the aircrew.
I just think it's very sad. Blame has to be apportioned anywhere. And I know we will be supporting all of the widows from that flight, no matter who they are, and I think that's very important. I still feel they don't really know, and human error is always a very good thing to blame. We never believed it, because we had a lot of respect for the RAF pilots, and we knew that these guys were special forces, properly trained, and we knew there's no way two good men like that would have driven their craft into a cliff.
The first response was absolute shock. Absolute shock. My mum in particular was extremely passionate about ensuring that Mr. Tapper and Mr. Cook's wives knew that we didn't hold them accountable or to blame. Because it's bad enough, I think, to lose your partner, your father, but to have the guilt of, ruining 27 or 28 other people's lives. No. These pilots aren't here to justify themselves. It's a very, very easy finger point.
I remember the solicitor coming very soon after the accident happened and saying to me, "This will be pilot error." And I thought, "Why would you know that?" And he said, "That's just the way it will go," and it did. The biggest thing was that character assassination of the pilots. It just upset me so much.
I think they quoted, it was in the region of 80% of the aircraft was destroyed. There is very little evidence to go on. So, based on that, how can they decide they know exactly what happened in those final stages?
From the point of view of the families of those who were being found to have been grossly negligent, this was a very severe blow, that the inquiry having concluded they couldn't attribute the cause of the accident, here were the air marshals coming to a different decision, but they were more senior, and therefore they were deemed to be more qualified to come to that sort of view.
The difficulty then was, how do we question a board of inquiry?
I was sitting at home in Port Stewart, and I opened up a copy of the Times of London, and there was a letter to the editor, and it was from a man I'd never heard of, a captain called Ralph Conn. And Ralph said, "I'm really curious as to why gross negligence was found, because I can't see the evidence of that." And I phoned him, and he was happy to talk, and I explained I was a reporter of the Belfast Telegraph. But he said, "Don't talk to me." He said, "Talk to the father of one of the pilots." And I was like, "You're kidding me. You know them?" Because we'd been told throughout by the Ministry of Defence and the RAF that these were Special Forces pilots and they're being protected by the system. There's a courtesy. They've suffered enough. They don't want to speak. But Captain Ralph Conn said, "Here's a phone number for John Cook, the father of Rick Cook, the co-pilot." So I called about 6 o'clock from my apartment. There was this gentle voice at the other end saying, "I'm delighted to finally hear from a journalist, from someone who's interested in my family story." John proceeded to tell me the concerns that his son had with the aircraft, the fact he'd increased his life insurance in the weeks before the crash. And then he said to me, "I know about aviation." He was the commander of the Concorde fleet. He was the guy who in the 1960s introduced black boxes into the data and cockpit voice recorder protocols so that if there is an accident, there's a final right of reply to the pilots. And Rick Cook and John Tapper had not been given a final right of reply, and instead they'd been held to the criminal equivalent of manslaughter in killing themselves and everyone else on board.
This was a huge stain on the reputations of two highly distinguished young pilots. So for them to be found guilty of gross negligence was just abhorrent to their families. There's not much that's fortunate about this ghastly affair, but one thing that is fortuitous, if you like, is the fact that that happened in Scotland. So there wasn't just a coroner's inquest, there was a fatal accident inquiry, which is a much more involved judicial process.
Around 50 witnesses will be called to give evidence in the fatal accident inquiry. Relatives of some of those killed are also in the court for the inquiry before Sheriff Sir Stephen Young.
A fatal accident inquiry is held in Scotland if someone dies during their work. But the air crew, the police and the soldiers were considered to be members of the Crown, and as a result, they're outside of the fatal accident inquiry legislation at the time. But because there was one civil servant on board who died, that allowed the fatal accident inquiry to be held.
This inquiry is expected to last around a month. It will focus on the alleged instrumentation failure, something dismissed by the RAF inquiry.
You had the two pilots being represented. You had the Ministry of Defence being represented. You had Boeing being represented. the families of the passengers being represented.
What we expect is to clear the boys' names. That's the two pilots who've been accused of negligence by the MOD and the Air Marshals, with no evidence at all to support their accusations.
The main facts that came to light was there had been certain issues with the helicopter being brought into service. It basically was the same airframe as the Mark I Chinook that had gone back to Boeing in the States to go through a major refit and then come back as this new improved helicopter. But it had lots of problems.
The inquiry has been told of a variety of mechanical failings among the RAF's fleet of Chinooks, but there was no evidence that technical problems led to the crash, though it was pointed out that that possibility couldn't be completely discounted.
Your son expressed his unhappiness to you?
Yes, he did, indeed. 3 times he came to me prior to, when he was on leave, prior to going over Northern Ireland, and said, "You will look after Sarah and Eleanor, won't you, Dad?" And on the 3rd time, I asked him, I said, "Now, come on, Rick, what is all this about?" And he said, "Dad, we're not ready, and the aircraft's certainly not ready."
So my father was very focused on the fact that Rick wasn't happy, a crash had happened, nothing's being explained.
I was reputed to know more about the Chinook. The RAF had officially said I know more about the Chinook from both the engineering and from the aircrew side than anybody else.
You said that you'd warned about sending them to Northern Ireland. What had you actually done, and what specifically were your concerns?
That the aircraft was not fully developed for service. That was my specific concern.
So tell us about your role in the Sheriff's inquiry.
I wasn't invited for the Sheriff's inquiry. I was told that they didn't require your expertise.
An RAF Board of Inquiry has already attached blame to the Chinook flight crew for the accident. The object of lawyers for the victims' families is to find out whether the aircraft itself or its modifications also contributed to the crash.
The morning has been very, very traumatic and distressing, with personal details about our husbands. We hope that in the next few weeks we'll find out the answers to questions that we've been asking ourselves for 18 months.
The sheriff spent a day actually in a Chinook asking good questions, trying to understand the pilots. He flew up in it. He immersed himself in that.
The sheriff, Sir Stephen Young, was assiduous. And in the end, after a detailed investigation, the Scottish Fatal Accident Inquiry said, we cannot stand behind this verdict, that there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever.
The sheriff, Sir Stephen Young, has said there isn't enough evidence to blame the men, Flight Lieutenant Jonathan Tapper and his colleague, Flight Lieutenant Richard Cook. Their families are relieved but angry at the MOD.
They made the accusations. I want the accusations retracted. That's both in Parliament and to the general public.
The Fatal Accident Inquiry did not support the Air Marshal's verdict. That was then ignored by the Ministry of Defence.
And the idea that a fatal accident inquiry by a highly respected Sheriff Sir Stephen Young was being dismissed by Westminster did not go down well. And the more you scratched the surface of this story, the more it became clear that the RAF's verdict that these pilots were guilty of gross negligence with absolutely no doubt whatsoever just would not stand. There was doubt everywhere. The whole situation was riven with doubt.
And then it turns out lots of things were withheld from the Board of Accident Inquiry. But there's been so much of it that you think it's not all omission. Some of this has to be commission. Some of this is deliberately being withheld.
The concern is that the Ministry of Defence and the Royal Air Force were themselves deciding what information was relevant to the inquiry, whereas some of us might suggest that that should have been for the inquiry to decide.
FADEC, Full Authority Digital Engine Control System, controls the Chinook's engines, and we found that at the time of the crash, the MOD was suing Boeing because of systematic errors in the FADEC software.
That was not shared with me at the time by either the Royal Air Force or the Ministry of Defence.
How were you misled so badly? Why were you misled so badly?
Well, my immediate reaction was to use quite a strong language and say, how on earth was I not told, was I not made aware that the Chinook helicopters had themselves been the subject of considerable concern within the Royal Air Force and within those in the Ministry of Defence responsible, how come the Secretary of State was not informed about that?
If an aircraft crashes and the Ministry of Defence are at that time in legal dispute with the manufacturers because of matters relating to that aircraft and its operational capability, on the face of it, that is information which at least should be shared with an inquiry so they can themselves judge whether it might or might not have contributed to the accident.
Many pilots were on record, both officially and unofficially, saying that they were deeply concerned about this software. And they'd found multiple errors, which meant the thing should have been on the ground, frankly. This software was way beyond the safe zone. These errors were deeply safety critical. And the fact that that wasn't disclosed to the Board of Inquiry, completely outrageous.
That patronising arrogance from the senior echelons of the RAF and the Ministry of Defence, I do believe it was a cover-up from day one.
We kept hitting a brick wall. The advisors, which come from the MOD, kept doing everything they could to block our progress. And suddenly it became a thing where we were being challenged as the pilots' families to come up with new evidence. And without that, nothing was going to be looked at. The MOD stuck to this for year in, year out.
I can tell you from grim experience, there was a huge operation by the MOD to close this down. It was absolutely blatant. No new evidence, nothing to see here, please move on.
And yet evidence did come forward, but everything that we presented, we were told that's not new evidence. We're going, well, it is to us. Other things came to light. So when you look at things like the manual my brother had for the Mark II Chinook, and you look at the bits that were missing, suddenly it made sense. Why are they missing? Well, they hadn't been issued yet by Boscombe Down.
The paperwork was nothing. Even on the immediate actions for emergencies, the pilots' flip cards, which they refer to, were just blank to be issued later. And we were flying the aircraft operationally.
So when you look at things like, why were they flying low? Well, the simple reason, the limitations on the aircraft, an icing limitation, they couldn't fly up over the high terrain. The air was too cold for the limitation on the aircraft, so they couldn't do that. As my father quoted at one time was, in civilian terms, they wouldn't have even started training the pilots for an aeroplane in that state. Now, as I understand it, this was the first helicopter to go into service using FADEC. And the problems they're having was engine surge and engine shut down.
All right, we're at 100%. Everything looks good in here, gauges all look good, got a good fuel split, engine oil pressure's up. Okay.
Rundown is no problem. A Chinook could fly on tests and things with an engine running down. It had sufficient power and the other engine to do everything virtually. But a run up and overspeeding the rotor is a problem.
Speaking to one test pilot, he said, you've got a matter of seconds to put drag on the rotor blades or you'll have rotor separation. So the first thing the pilot will do will be raising up the collective to do that. And that would have made the helicopter climb straight away. So they'd have gone into cloud. So, we don't know. Did that happen? We don't know, but it's a possibility.
Clear on the left side, everything looks good, no smoke, no leaks. AO's gonna enter the helicopter. Okay, check number 1, boost.
It could have been a FADEC problem, or it could have been a control jam, where part had become detached, and this was a known problem on the Chinook. The results would have been totally unpredictable, contending with absolutely nothing till it went wrong. The RAF contended it would have showed, if there had been a fault there, it would have showed up on the transit over the sea. That's complete rubbish.
And then we hear the test pilots had grounded it prior to the crash anyway.
There is a document from the test pilots who say, in the strongest possible terms, quote unquote, do not fly these aircraft. Here is this going out within hours of this taking off, saying in the strongest possible terms, do not fly these things. They are not safe. We are not flying ours. Don't do it.
Documents that we have here prove that warnings and recommendations about the Chinook computer software were simply ignored. This one, written on the day of the crash, states that it's imperative that it be recommended in the strongest possible terms that the RAF should cease operations.
People don't become RAF test pilots because they like an easy life. They become RAF test pilots because they're slightly loopy and they're the best pilots in the world. And for the test pilots at Boscombe Down to ground a fleet of Chinooks, there must be really serious problems.
Can you remember what your thoughts and actions were in the days immediately after the crash?
Yes. I was at Odium and I had phone calls from Tony Cable for help in investigating various anomalies that were found in the Chinook. Control positions on the initial impact they could predict quite well were really strange. I was investigating those control positions about 3 days later on an aircraft at Odium with the blades removed. I had the Boeing engineers, the chief techs, everybody all around the aircraft measuring things, literally with rulers. And it was at that moment that I was stopped, ordered to stop helping the Farnborough investigators. I was told I was not to communicate to anyone about this accident, including Tony Cable. And I said, is that a request or is that an order? And he said, that is a direct order.
Tony Cable had been appointed by a board of inquiry from the RAF itself to get to the bottom of this crash. Why were they telling the one person who knew this aircraft inside out, who had raised concerns, not to speak to him?
I can't answer that question because I don't know the answer.
Well, did you ask it at the time? Why would you not want me to talk to this guy?
Oh, I certainly asked why. I got no answer. You know, it's really simple. If it's a direct order and I'm told it's a direct order, I complied with that, you know. But when I left the service, different.
Bob Burke was absolutely vital because this was a man who loved the RAF. This was a man who felt the chain of command was everything. He was somebody who came out of the shadows, if you like. This guy is one of the leading helicopter test pilots in the world, turning on his own for the sake of the truth and the sake of future generations of Chinook pilots.
It would appear, I think, to have something to do with the weather conditions because the cliffs are not so high that a helicopter would normally have flown into them. It looks as if the fog, which has been very thick, 10 feet visibility at times, must have been a factor.
What became a very important area was what were the meteorological conditions on land versus what would you see from the cockpit as you approached the land that night.
It did become clear that the weather that day was actually very good. The bad weather on the night after the accident had happened was something which set in fairly later on in the day. It was a peculiar but not unusual situation there because of the topography of the Mull of Kintyre. So it's almost a small mountain. That creates its own weather system very often. It's very often shrouded in fog, whereas the surrounding area was clear. And that was exactly the situation.
The lady who is in her house on the coast of Northern Ireland hears the accident aircraft overfly her house and looks out towards what she describes as the cloud-shrouded landmass of the Mull of Kintyre. Now, if she can see it from her house in Northern Ireland, you can be sure that the two pilots can see it.
He was in clear air. They weren't in cloud. The Board of Inquiry didn't say they were flying in cloud, low level. The Air Marshals did.
So you then start saying, how, in clear conditions, does it fly straight into an area of high ground?
One of the things that was known about the Mark II was after a period of stable flight, and you input the control to go left, it'll go right. And that fits exactly with the characteristics of the final seconds of ZT-576. I believe as the aircraft was flying across water, stable, purposeful, they inputted to go left, which is where the map said they were going to go. That would take you around the Mull of Kintyre. And instead, when you input to go left, the aircraft goes right. I believe that the aircraft was not under their control when it crashed. The pedals and where they were found was unrecognizable as a Chinook technique unless you were doing your last best effort to climb and you're putting an immense amount of pressure into the pedals. The evidence suggests that the airload master at the front, Graham Forbes, had jumped in, was in the jump seat. So he was helping the handling pilot and the non-handling captain in the final seconds. So I think they were in a fight of their lives.
I was angry. I knew there'd been a travesty of justice. I was always conscious of that right from the very, very beginning. You know, I also know my father, and he would not have wanted to see two young pilots, you know, scapegoated. I was in the military myself, so I had an understanding of the Air Force and who these people were. I knew they would hang you out to dry.
You know, these weren't people who would be inclined to rock the boat, to sort of test the system, to poke the ant's nest. Apart from anything else, to conceal the degree of anger you must feel. Never ceased to amaze me, the way they conducted themselves. It was extraordinary.
We wanted Rick to rest in peace, and I know that the Tapper family wanted the same for John. But how could they rest in peace when this had happened and they're not there to defend themselves? So it was a case of whatever's comfortable have to put to one side because this needs addressing.
For some of the families, this caused a real split. Some family members, quite understandably, to this day, say the pilots were grossly negligent. They're not prepared to entertain an alternative. They've been told the answer by the Ministry of Defence. They believe the government position. They have got the reason, and they wish that people would stop asking questions because it keeps drudging it up in the memories and the tragedy of it. And I'm sympathetic to that, and I realise that the work of journalism sometimes causes offence because it doesn't square with the facts. There are a lot of unanswered questions that we need to get to the bottom of when it comes to understanding the motivation of these senior officers.
The Chinook is the workhorse of the RAF. There's things that only a Chinook can lift in theatre. It's no wonder these Chinooks have been around for so many years, so many decades, because they're really, really useful. I mean, it would have totally undermined the UK's mission-critical readiness to engage in military conflicts overseas if you haven't got the Chinook.
You can see how some people then believe, particularly the families of the pilots, that there was indeed a cover-up.
Well, the question then would be, why was there a cover-up? What was the self-interest? And I've thought about that as well. Now, the honest position I have to say is I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But all I can say is something hypothetical. But it's one has to think of. If there became a public question of concern about the technical competence of the Chinooks, about the software, about whether the Chinook should be allowed to fly, it wouldn't just be what caused that particular accident. It's do we have to take all the Chinooks out of service? Do they have to be removed from the availability? And that would have been a very serious blow for the RAF because you can't just replace your whole fleet of Chinooks automatically.
At the centre of this story, the relationship between the MOD and Boeing, the manufacturers of the Chinook. These are multi-million-pound contracts that the MOD had with Boeing, and that relationship really is at the heart. It's the kernel of the special relationship, which, of course, has massive diplomatic significance. I mean, the Berlin Wall had just fallen. The special relationship was absolutely key. It was the biggest game in town when it comes to geopolitics. And, kicking the tyres of a helicopter crash, that lots of people had forgotten about, tragic as it was, really wasn't the done thing, because what you were doing, you were undermining or questioning why the MOD was so determined that this helicopter was absolutely fine and why it was protecting Boeing in the way that it was.
The view of the senior officers reported was that the two pilots displayed, perhaps even for a short moment of time, such negligence of their responsibilities.
Both the families feel very strongly that if you have a charge of gross negligence against two highly qualified pilots, and by inference against the whole crew because they worked as a unit, both for the sake of the Royal Air Force and common justice, it should not be allowed to rest.
The verdict of negligence is one, very sadly, it is impossible to resist.
I don't know why the MOD was so obsessed with blocking everything we were trying to do to get justice. What was so wrong with having an independent inquiry? Surely it just gets to the truth.
The board was unable to determine a definite cause. The board could not avoid a degree of speculation. If you can't avoid a degree of speculation, you cannot then break the RAF's own rules that say only in cases where there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever can deceased aircrew be found negligent.
Well, there's no chance of it reopening at all, then? The inquiry won't reopen?
Oh, it's very unsatisfactory. I mean, we have two governments reading to the same script.
When you think about it, this happened under a Conservative government, and yet it was Labour ministers in power who were determined that this investigation was not going to go any further.
I went to see Jeff Hoon when he was Secretary of State, trying to support the view that the inquiry should be reopened. And he clearly was being advised, even then, by his officials, by the RAF, that that wasn't necessary.
Had they been flying with a minimum visibility allowed for visual flight rules, then by the waypoint change, they would have seen the landmass of the Mull and would have recognised their perilous position. They should have taken prompt action by flying higher or by turning away.
They should have taken prompt action by flying higher or turning away. The finding of negligence is therefore based on the fact that they failed to take such avoiding action.
What I'm very angry about is the fact that two good RAF officers with ability above and beyond the normal average, because they were special forces crews, have been accused of gross negligence when there are so very many other possibilities.
The various Westminster committees got involved. The Defence Select Committee asked questions. The Public Accounts Committee that deals with the money and the significant money in the Chinook fleet, they also asked questions. They also came back with, we certainly can't say it was the pilots.
The word furious is overused by reporters, but it's the right adjective to describe the reaction of the Ministry of Defence today to a report from the most important committee in Parliament which dared to question the findings of an RAF investigation.
So you had all these reports swirling around, all of them going in one direction, all of them by really serious people and serious organisations, both inside and outside Parliament. You had people like David Davis, who at the time was the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the most powerful committee in the House of Commons.
I spoke to Air Chief Marshal Sir William Ratton, one of the reviewing officers to the Board of Inquiry set up by the RAF. I put it to him that if RAF regulations at the time said the burden of proof was that there should be no doubt whatsoever before finding the pilots negligent, hadn't he failed to follow his own rules?
There is no doubt whatsoever. There wasn't then, there isn't now.
But that simply can't be true.
Well, perhaps you could explain why it can't be true.
Because there is plenty of doubt.
And what is that doubt?
The doubt relates to technical matters, to do with computers, to do with all sorts of other possibilities which you looked into. Now, you should have made a ruling on the basis that there was no doubt whatsoever.
The litany of problems would at least get you to the threshold of doubt, where you could say, hang on, we can't say these guys simply drove this aircraft into a mountainside. But the Air Vice Marshals couldn't find it in themselves to do that.
The PACs and the Scottish Fatal Accident Inquiry both rejected the option of calling my colleagues and I to give them evidence. Nor indeed have I had the opportunity to invite them to explain their analysis of the essential elements of evidence which are in front of them.
Sir William, I suggest to you that is a position of some breathtaking arrogance.
Well, that is a position that one holds, Mr. Paxman.
On top of the grief, it was insulting. Some people say, in time, don't worry, it's fine. I say, no, that's rubbish. Grief never goes. In time, you learn to live with it. That's the difference. And it's the same with the campaign. It took us a bit of time, but we learned to live with the campaign day by day.
In the end, you mount enough evidence that you get the body politic involved, and that was the crucial thing.
What we would need is for the Ministry of Defence to reopen the RAF's own Board of Inquiry. And in view of Malcolm Rifkin's intervention and the report from 3 distinguished members of the Royal Aeronautical Society, there is every reason why the Ministry of Defence should do so.
Various MP select committees in both the Commons and the Lords tried to hold the MOD and the RAF to account.
It's now 8 years since a group of Britain's most senior intelligence officers were killed in the Chinook crash. The events have been studied by an RAF Board of Inquiry, the Public Accounts Select Committee, the Air Accident Investigation Branch, a Fatal Accident Inquiry, and today the conclusions of a House of Lords Select Committee were published too. All of the above investigations decided the pilots should not be blamed.
The beginning of the end, perhaps, of a long and painful journey. The parents of the 2 pilots have never denied their sons might have made a mistake. They simply felt there was no way of being sure. And the Lords have reached the same conclusion. The RAF's reviewing officers, they say, were not justified in blaming the pilots. There's simply not enough evidence to meet the high standard of proof required.
27 other families were sadly affected by this tragedy. And it's not just clearing our sons' names, it's also trying to clear up what on earth happened. We don't know. We never have pretended to know. But we have always maintained that neither did the Ministry of Defence.
Air Chief Marshal Ratton is retired, but Air Chief Marshal Sir John Day is currently head of Strike Command. Today's report criticises him for repeatedly treating his own hypotheses and assumptions as facts.
It's a question of honour. As far as we're concerned, our boys have now been exonerated. What we want now is the government to catch us up.
The government of the day wouldn't look at it. They kept saying, well, no new evidence. We had a commitment from successive leaders of the Conservative Party that if the Conservatives came into power, they would set up an independent look at all the facts that exist to say, is this a fair judgment on the 2 pilots?
These pilots were skillful, honourable young men doing their duty. That's what they're...
The chair of the PAC, David Davis, was able to say to David Cameron, look, this isn't right. This was on our watch. Look at the people who now want this looked at again. Rifkin, King, Major. And this will go down well in Scotland. What's not to like? So in the end, after all the investigative legwork had been done, I think raw politics kicked in and ensured it was in that Tory manifesto.
In opposition, we said that there would be an independent review of the evidence, and I can confirm that the Ministry of Defence is already looking at the best way to undertake that. We will certainly live up to the promise we made in opposition.
Sandy Phillip has agreed to conduct this inquiry. He is a former High Court judge, a former judge in Scotland, and a former president of the Scottish Lands Tribunal.
Lord Phillip looked exhaustively through a huge amount of technical information. It was overwhelming.
He said none of this was safe jurisdiction because it is essentially a conviction. It's an unsafe conviction. It should not have been accepted at any level.
What puzzles me is that it took so many years for those within the Ministry of Defence, and particularly within the Royal Air Force, at senior levels, to recognise that they had a case to answer.
They were more interested in protecting the organisation on that crash than actually finding out the root cause analysis and preventing reoccurrence. It was all about reputational damage.
Tapper was ordered, not asked, ordered to take the Mark II over the Mark I that he wanted to take, and they put 25 passengers on board. It's embarrassment. That is motivation for finding a neat answer.
It was a prestige flight by the Air Force to show the Army that the Chinook was ready for service.
I have written to the widows of the two pilots, to the father of Jonathan Tapper and to the brother of Richard Cook to express the Ministry of Defence's apology for the distress which was caused to them by the findings of negligence. I also wish to express that apology publicly in this House today.
That was emotional. Yeah. 16 years campaigning, and to hear that was very special. It was long, long overdue.
Yeah, my father sadly passed away in 2005. His last words to me were on this case, and for me to try and keep fighting to clear Rick's name. My father maintained that justice has no expiry date. Our family and the Tapper family have always believed in what this country could do for us in terms of justice, and today that's been proved.
I remember it very clearly, just watching them say this was a wrong verdict. And I just sat and sobbed. They weren't even my family members, but I had felt so bad about those boys being wronged, and it's such a relief.
As a military pilot, and as a pilot, if I could go back in time and pick the crew for that day, I'd still pick that crew. That's who I'd want to be in charge of that aircraft.
This is way bigger than a helicopter crash because this strikes at the centre of the familiar British pathology, which is an over-obsession with process and a complete ignoring of outcome. The process is that, oh my God, the British Army have been shooting people dead on the streets, and we can't admit to that. Oh my God, the police have screwed up at a football match, we can't admit to that. Oh my goodness me, there's something wrong with the helicopters that were pushed into service. We can't admit to that. Because in the immediate terms, in the process, someone's career might be damaged, which is losing sight of the much bigger thing that actually, if you admit all this, the reputation of the British Army is massively improved if you face the truth. The reputation of the police force in South Yorkshire, massively improved. The reputation of the RAF, massively improved. And that's a huge and stupid mistake that they go on making time and time again.
This was an instance of the establishment turning in on itself. That was something to behold. That was a quite incredible situation for the British establishment to find itself in. But in my view, I'm honoured to have been a small part of this story. I didn't set out to unearth a cover-up. I set out to make sure that these two dead pilots weren't found guilty of gross negligence, and also to try and do a bit to make sure that existing servicemen and women weren't put into helicopters that weren't fit to fly.
And I broke the original story that even in death, the pilots couldn't be excused. Then I got the Cook family to say, hang on a minute, David, your reporting has been inaccurate. So you fall short and you're inaccurate. That's on me to repay the public record. And that's when I got angry. And that's when I was determined to continue to follow the story for as long as it took. Now, I worked for a bunch of news organizations later, but I never gave up the story. And so while it's uncomfortable or is a discomfort that I don't have the answer to the crash, I'm also quite happy to live in the grey, because that's all the facts allow me to do. And it's a lot better to sit in the grey than it is to be black and white and say John Tapper and Rick Cook did that. I suspect the authorities know what happened. The Chinook papers have now been put into secret lock and key for 50 years. The 25-year cabinet rule was suspended for the Chinook crash. Again, why? What's missing? What do we not know? And why don't we know it? I think they do know. And I think they tried to take us to the place that was the easiest answer, which is dead men don't talk.
To me, it's still very current and real. I have never wanted to do anything but be an Air Force pilot, and I worship the Air Force, I really did. And I'm afraid that really got shattered. It's a very sad saga. So I feel very, very strongly about it. I still do.
It's amazing how nature regenerated, to give us all hope that everything can regenerate given time.
You know, I've been to Mull many, many times since then. You know, I love going to the Mull of Kintyre. It's a beautiful place. You know, Mum's got the layout of where all the bodies were. So we knew where Dad's body came to rest. So I remember lying down on that on one particular trip, just lying in the same spot where my dad bled out. I don't know why that was important to me, but it was.
My father was 6 weeks away from retirement. I do believe he played a significant role in eventually the process that led to peace. And I think it's a great sadness that everybody who died on that helicopter didn't get to see what subsequently happened, because they all will have contributed to it in some way.
You can't feel sorry for yourself because you're okay, you're there. But the only thing that does make me very, very sad is the things that Kevin has missed throughout his life. He was 44 when he died, so he missed a lot. And he was so happy at that stage in his life. That still gives me sadness. If Kevin was still here, I hope I'd still be hill walking with him.
Rick definitely felt very let down. He went about his duty as a professional. He was very loyal to Queen and country, and the thought that, especially for his wife and his daughter, that they would be having to face this after his death when there weren't facts to support it. And I think, especially for his daughter, who was only one, just one at the time he was killed, she was going to grow up with a shadow of her father. He would have been very angry.
Mum slept with a picture on Dad's pillow. She also documented each day that passed, the number of days it had been since the accident had happened. That it's unfathomable, even for me, he's my father, but this was her life partner. She married him at 16 years old. So it's all that she knew. And that's very sad. So beyond, as I said, the politics, beyond all that, there was a very personal and private side to all of these victims of the accident.
2 days after the accident, I went back to my flat in London, and a letter arrived, and it was postmarked from Northern Ireland, from Belfast, and it was a letter from my brother, and it was written the night before the crash, on the 1st of June. What was comforting was it was just a regular letter from Rick. It had all the humour in that he would normally portray. It was a regular letter, and it's very precious to me, because at least everything was normal up to a certain point.